Most people move through life believing they are experiencing reality directly, as if the world simply is what it is, solid, obvious, and beyond question. Yet what they are actually experiencing is something far more subtle and far more limiting. A carefully constructed interpretation of reality that has been built layer by layer since childhood. This interpretation feels natural precisely because it has been with them for so long. It shapes what feels possible, what feels ridiculous, what feels dangerous, and what feels unquestionable. And because it operates beneath conscious awareness, it rarely gets examined. People assume they are seeing the world as it truly is, when in fact they are seeing it through a narrow perceptual lens that filters out far more than it reveals. This is the greatest illusion humanity lives under. Not that the world is fake, but that our understanding of it is complete. From an early age, we are taught how to interpret existence, what success looks like, what authority sounds like, what is considered normal, and what falls outside acceptable boundaries. These lessons don't arrive as commands. They arrive as repetition. Repetition through parents, teachers, media, peers, and culture itself. Over time, repetition becomes familiarity, and familiarity becomes truth. Once an idea reaches that stage, it stops being questioned. It becomes background noise, invisible, yet constantly shaping perception. The mind then does something remarkable and dangerous at the same time. It confuses interpretation with reality itself. When that happens, alternative perspectives don't just seem incorrect, they feel unsettling, even threatening. Not because they've been logically examined and dismissed, but because they challenge the mental structure that provides certainty and stability. This is why questioning deeply held assumptions often triggers emotional reactions rather than thoughtful discussion. The mind is defending not truth, but comfort. It is protecting the illusion that the map it has been given is the territory itself. What makes this illusion so powerful is that it does not require enforcement. No one needs to stand over people and tell them what they are allowed to think. The boundaries have already been internalized. Thoughts that fall outside the accepted range trigger discomfort before they are even fully formed. Curiosity pulls back on its own. Self-censorship happens silently. And because this process feels voluntary, people believe they are free, unaware that their freedom has been carefully shaped to operate within invisible limits. This illusion also creates a profound misunderstanding about control. People often imagine control as something external laws, force, authority figures. But the most effective control operates internally through perception. When perception is shaped, behavior follows automatically. Choices feel personal, yet they consistently align with the same narrow framework. Society then forms around these shared assumptions, reinforcing them through consensus and social pressure. The illusion becomes collective, self-sustaining, and extremely resistant to challenge. Recognizing this does not mean rejecting everything or claiming special knowledge. It means understanding that reality is far wider than the version we are taught to accept. The moment someone realizes that their perception has been conditioned, not chosen, a quiet shift begins. They stop asking only what they believe and start asking why. And that question alone has the power to loosen the illusion, because the illusion depends entirely on never being examined. Once you begin to see that perception shapes reality, the next question naturally arises: where does that perception come from? Very little of it is formed through independent discovery. From the moment a human being enters the world, interpretation is provided for them, not through conspiracy or cruelty, but through inheritance. Parents pass on their understanding of life, shaped by their own experiences and limitations. Education systems then reinforce a standardized version of reality, presenting it not as interpretation, but as fact. History is simplified, complexity is reduced, and curiosity is subtly guided toward approved conclusions. This process is not designed to expand awareness, but to produce consistency, predictable citizens who share the same reference points and assumptions. Media then takes over as the constant reinforcement mechanism. Through repetition, emphasis, and omission, certain narratives become dominant while others fade from view. Over time, the mind begins to associate familiarity with truth. What is repeated feels real. What is unseen feels irrelevant or extreme. And because most people consume the same sources of information, perception becomes synchronized across entire populations. Consensus emerges not necessarily because something is true, but because it is ubiquitous. Once consensus forms, deviation begins to feel abnormal, even when it is rooted in logic or evidence. Social pressure completes the process. Humans are deeply wired to seek belonging, and belonging is maintained by agreement. From a young age, people learn which questions receive approval and which invite discomfort or rejection. They observe the consequences faced by those who challenge accepted views and adjust accordingly. This conditioning rarely feels oppressive because it is rarely explicit. Instead, it manifests as instinct, a sense of what is appropriate, reasonable, or safe to think and say. Over time, these instincts replace curiosity, and exploration gives way to conformity without the individual ever noticing the transition. The most effective aspect of this programming is that it convinces people their thoughts are entirely their own. Because no one is openly dictating beliefs, individuals assume they have arrived at their conclusions independently. Yet when millions of people reach the same conclusions through the same informational pathways, independence becomes an illusion. Thought is guided not by force, but by environment. And environments, once established, shape behavior automatically. What makes this process difficult to challenge is that it is emotionally anchored. Beliefs formed early in life become tied to identity, memory, and belonging. To question them later can feel like betraying one's past, one's community, or even oneself. This emotional resistance has nothing to do with truth and everything to do with security. The mind prefers certainty over complexity, even when certainty is built on fragile foundations. Understanding how perception is programmed is not about assigning blame or imagining hidden enemies at every turn. It is about recognizing that human awareness develops within systems, and systems have priorities. When those priorities favor order, predictability, and control, perception naturally narrows. Yet, the moment this process becomes visible, it loses much of its power. Awareness interrupts automation. And once a person realizes that much of what they believe was absorbed rather than examined, the door to genuine understanding begins to open, slowly, quietly, and often uncomfortably, but irreversibly. One of the most revealing aspects of perception is not how strongly people believe certain things, but how fiercely they defend them when questioned. This reaction is rarely about facts or evidence. It is psychological. Once a belief becomes embedded in identity, Challenging it feels like a personal attack rather than an intellectual exercise. The mind responds defensively, not because it has carefully examined an opposing idea and rejected it, but because uncertainty threatens the emotional stability that belief provides. In this way, the illusion protects itself. It recruits the very people living within it to act as its guardians. Human beings are conditioned to associate agreement with safety and dissent with risk. From an early age, acceptance is rewarded and deviation is subtly discouraged. Over time, this creates an internal alarm system that activates whenever a belief is challenged. That alarm is experienced as discomfort, irritation, or even anger. Rather than asking whether the challenge has merit, the mind seeks to neutralize the discomfort as quickly as possible. Dismissal, ridicule, and labeling become tools of emotional defense, allowing the illusion to remain intact without requiring examination. This is why deeply ingrained narratives survive even when evidence accumulates against them. To abandon a long-held belief is not simply to change one's mind. It is to dismantle a mental structure that has organized one's understanding of the world. That structure influences relationships, career choices, moral judgments, and self-image. Letting it go can feel like stepping into psychological freefall. The mind resists this, not out of ignorance, but out of self-preservation. Certainty, even false certainty, feels safer than openness. Social reinforcement intensifies this effect. When beliefs are shared by a group, questioning them risks isolation. The fear of exclusion is powerful enough to override curiosity and critical thinking. People learn quickly that it is often easier to conform outwardly than to explore inwardly. Over time, this leads to a culture where consensus is mistaken for truth and repetition replaces understanding. The illusion thrives because it is constantly echoed, validated, and defended collectively. Another key reason people defend the illusion is responsibility. If reality is more complex than they were taught, then many assumptions they've lived by may be incomplete or incorrect. That realization carries an implicit responsibility to rethink choices, question authority, and tolerate uncertainty. For many, this feels overwhelming. It is far easier to insist that the existing framework is correct than to face the possibility that it is limited. In this sense, defending the illusion becomes a way of avoiding discomfort rather than seeking truth. Yet the irony is that this defense is entirely unnecessary. Questioning perception does not require rejecting everything or adopting a new rigid belief system. It requires only openness, the willingness to admit that one's current understanding may not be complete. The illusion persists because people believe it offers stability when in reality it restricts awareness. The moment this is recognized, even faintly, the grip of the illusion begins to loosen. Not dramatically, not instantly, but steadily. And once that process begins, perception starts to expand in ways that no authority, narrative, or consensus can fully contain. Once perception has been shaped and defended, control no longer needs to announce itself. This is the point at which authority becomes most effective, because it operates without resistance. When people share the same assumptions about what is normal, reasonable, and possible, behavior aligns automatically. There is no need for overt coercion because the boundaries of thought have already been internalized. Individuals police themselves, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a desire to remain within the accepted framework that gives them identity and belonging. Throughout history, the most enduring systems of control have relied not on physical domination, but on narrative dominance. Those who define the story define the limits of discussion. When a particular version of reality is repeated often enough, it becomes the reference point against which all other ideas are judged. Alternatives are no longer debated on their merits. They are dismissed as unrealistic, irresponsible, or irrelevant. In this way, control becomes subtle and efficient. It does not confront opposition directly, it renders it invisible. This process is strengthened by the illusion of choice. People are encouraged to believe they are free because they can choose between options, opinions, and identities. Yet all of these choices exist within a tightly controlled range. The boundaries are rarely stated explicitly, which makes them harder to recognize. Freedom appears abundant on the surface, while the deeper structure remains untouched. As long as discussion stays within acceptable limits, the system remains unchallenged. Debate becomes noise rather than transformation. Technology has accelerated this dynamic dramatically. Information can now be filtered, prioritized, and shaped at scale, influencing perception before conscious awareness engages. Narratives spread not because they are true, but because they are amplified. Meanwhile, ideas that challenge the dominant framework are quietly buried, delayed, or marginalized. This creates a feedback loop in which visibility is mistaken for validity. What is seen is assumed to be important. What is unseen is assumed not to exist. Control operates through omission rather than repression. The most revealing aspect of this system is how little force it requires. People comply because compliance feels sensible. They adapt because adaptation feels necessary. Resistance appears impractical, even immature. Over time, this conditions individuals to associate stability with conformity and uncertainty with danger. The desire for order outweighs the desire for truth, and control becomes self-sustaining. Understanding this dynamic does not mean rejecting structure or cooperation. It means recognizing the difference between guidance and manipulation. When perception is managed, even benevolent-sounding narratives can limit awareness. The real question is not whether a system claims to act in the public interest, but whether it allows genuine inquiry and dissent. Because the moment questioning is discouraged, perception begins to narrow and freedom becomes performative rather than real. Ultimately, control through perception is fragile because it depends on belief. The moment enough individuals begin to observe rather than automatically accept, the system loses its invisibility. It must then either reveal itself more openly or adapt once again. Awareness is the variable that control cannot fully predict or contain. And that is why perception, once expanded, becomes the most powerful form of freedom there is, not because it resists authority, but because it no longer requires permission to think. Many people sense that something has changed in the way the world feels, even if they struggle to articulate it. Life appears more constrained, conversations more cautious, and acceptable opinions more limited than they once were. This sensation is not imaginary. It is the psychological effect of a narrowing perceptual field. As narratives become more standardized and boundaries of thought more tightly defined, the range of ideas people feel comfortable exploring begins to shrink. What was once open to discussion becomes sensitive, then controversial, and eventually unmentionable. This progression happens gradually, often unnoticed, until the absence of openness feels normal. One of the reasons this narrowing is so effective is that it is framed as maturity or responsibility. Questioning deeply held assumptions is increasingly portrayed as reckless or disruptive, while agreement is equated with intelligence and social awareness. In such an environment, curiosity is subtly discouraged. People learn to measure their words carefully, not because they lack thoughts, but because expressing them carries social risk. Over time, silence becomes a habit, and habit becomes identity. The mind adapts to its confines and begins to treat them as the natural order of things. This narrowing also affects imagination. When the boundaries of acceptable thought contract, so too does the sense of possibility. Alternative ways of organizing society, understanding reality, or relating to one another begin to feel unrealistic, even when they are logically coherent. The future is presented as fixed, inevitable, and beyond influence. This creates a population that expects less, dreams less, and questions less, not because it lacks intelligence, but because it has been conditioned to see limitation as realism. The paradox is that this contraction is often accompanied by an explosion of information. People are exposed to more content than ever before, yet understanding deepens very little. Quantity replaces depth, noise replaces insight. And within that noise, only certain themes are amplified while others fade away. The result is a form of informational overload that actually discourages critical thinking. When everything feels urgent, nothing receives sustained attention. This constant distraction keeps perception shallow and reactive. As reality feels narrower, people seek comfort in certainty. Strong opinions, rigid identities, and simplified explanations offer relief from complexity. Yet these same comforts further reinforce the boundaries of perception. Complexity is avoided, nuance is lost, and discussion becomes polarized rather than exploratory. The world appears divided not because it truly is, but because perception has been trained to see only opposing extremes within a confined spectrum. Recognizing this narrowing is not about nostalgia or idealizing the past. It is about noticing how quickly openness can disappear when questioning becomes socially expensive. The feeling that reality has shrunk is a signal, not a failure. It indicates that perception is being constrained and that awareness is pushing gently against those constraints. When that awareness is acknowledged rather than suppressed, the sense of confinement begins to loosen. Reality does not actually narrow, perception does. And perception, unlike physical structures, can expand the moment it is allowed to. At the core of everything discussed is a simple but profound realization. The most fundamental freedom available to any human being is the freedom to perceive. Before speech, before action, before resistance, there is awareness. And awareness is where genuine change begins. When perception is reclaimed, control loses its foundation, because control depends on unexamined assumptions and inherited beliefs. This does not require confrontation or rebellion. It requires observation. The ability to notice thoughts rather than automatically identify with them is the first step out of the illusion. Reclaiming perception means becoming comfortable with uncertainty. It means resisting the urge to replace one rigid belief system with another. Many people leave one framework only to adopt a new one, just as restrictive, because certainty feels safer than openness. Yet true freedom lies in flexibility, in the willingness to hold ideas lightly and revise them as understanding deepens. An open mind is not empty, it is adaptive. It allows perception to evolve rather than stagnate. This shift begins internally, but its effects extend outward. When individuals stop reacting automatically to narratives designed to provoke fear or outrage, those narratives lose their power. Emotional manipulation works only when it goes unnoticed. Awareness creates a pause, and in that pause, choice reappears. Behavior becomes intentional rather than conditioned. And when enough individuals operate from awareness rather than reflex, societal patterns begin to shift naturally without force. It is important to recognize that reclaiming perception does not mean disengaging from the world. On the contrary, it allows deeper engagement. Without the constant pressure to conform or defend identity, curiosity returns. Listening becomes possible again. Dialogue replaces polarization. This does not guarantee agreement, but it restores respect for complexity. In a world increasingly shaped by simplified narratives, the ability to tolerate nuance becomes a quiet form of resistance. The systems that benefit from perceptual limitation often appear overwhelming, but they are far less stable than they seem. They rely on belief, repetition, and participation. When participation becomes conscious rather than automatic, their influence weakens. History shows that shifts in awareness often precede visible change by many years. What appears immovable can dissolve rapidly once perception reaches a critical threshold. Ultimately, the invitation is not to accept a new version of reality, but to question the one you've been given. Not to reject authority blindly, but to observe how authority operates within the mind. When perception expands, fear contracts, possibility reemerges, and the sense of inevitability that once felt suffocating begins to loosen its grip. The greatest illusion then is not the world itself, but the belief that we are trapped within a single interpretation of it. The moment that belief is questioned, freedom is no longer something granted by external systems. It becomes something lived internally, quietly, independently, and with clarity. And in a world increasingly defined by managed perception, that internal freedom may be the most powerful transformation of all.